The idea of buying Gaza, a provocative thought experiment. The proposition of buying Gaza is not just a political maneuver or a simple economic transaction. It is a conceptual thought experiment that forces us to engage with deep questions about power, justice, sovereignty, and the role of external actors in shaping the fate of contested regions. Historically, the Middle East has been a region where ideas, strategies, and solutions for resolving conflict have often been driven by outside forces, colonial powers, superpowers, and international bodies. This proposal brings these historical dynamics into sharp focus, questioning whether a region like Gaza, marked by its political complexity, historical grievances, and deep-rooted identity, can be purchased as a solution to its ongoing crisis. The idea challenges the conventional wisdom that sovereignty and territorial integrity are inviolable, questioning the ethical implications of external control over disputed lands. It also provokes a broader inquiry into the ability of the international community to intervene in the internal affairs of a nation, particularly in a way that could drastically reshape the future of its people. While this may seem an audacious or radical thought experiment, it echoes the themes of imperialism, nation-building, and the long-standing role of external powers in shaping the modern Middle East. The balance between ambition and reality. Ambition at its core represents the belief that significant, often disruptive change is possible. The vision of purchasing Gaza and the associated idea of relocating Palestinians to Sinai is driven by a sense of urgency to break the perpetual cycle of violence, poverty, and instability. This ambition is commendable in its desire for an innovative solution to an intractable issue. However, ambition must meet reality, an important juxtaposition in the discourse surrounding the Gaza question. Gaza, like many historically contested regions, is not merely a space marked by territorial borders. It is a site of collective memory, deep trauma, and national identity. The reality of Gaza cannot be reduced to simply economic challenges or geopolitical calculations. The region is entangled in a web of historical grievances dating back to the early 20th century, starting with the creation of Israel and the subsequent displacement of Palestinians. This long-standing sense of injustice complicates any proposal that seeks to alter Gaza's political status or territorial integrity, regardless of how pragmatic or well-resourced it may seem. Moreover, the notion of moving Gaza's population to Sinai, a region fraught with its own political challenges and historical sensitivities, further complicates matters. The Sinai Peninsula is not a blank canvas. It is home to Bedouin communities whose ancestral lands have been claimed for generations, and it is also part of Egypt's geopolitical and cultural identity. Thus, the proposed solution of relocating Gaza's population is far from straightforward. The reality of Egypt's sovereignty over Sinai introduces both practical and ethical dilemmas. Can Egypt consent to such a project? What would the impact be on local Bedouin communities? Would the region's fragile environment sustain large-scale human settlement? In the broader context, historical efforts to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have often been guided by an ambition to solve the problem quickly, but the reality of decades of entrenched political and social structures has meant that progress is slow and faltering. From the Oslo Accords to the Camp David negotiations, the pursuit of peace has often been challenged by the deeply rooted grievances and rivalries that no external solution has been able to resolve in a lasting way. Pragmatism versus principle. The tension between pragmatism and principle lies at the heart of the buying Gaza proposal. Pragmatism, in this sense, embodies the desire to find practical solutions to a deeply rooted crisis. The situation in Gaza is dire, with widespread poverty, unemployment, political stagnation, and frequent outbreaks of violence. The people of Gaza have endured decades of suffering, and from a purely pragmatic standpoint, a solution that can address the humanitarian crisis, provide stability, and reduce regional tensions is worth considering. However, the very nature of this proposal raises profound questions about the principles that should guide international interventions. At the core of these concerns is the principle of self-determination, a cornerstone of international law. The right of peoples to freely choose their political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development is enshrined in documents like the United Nations Charter and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. To propose the purchase of Gaza risks undermining this principle by treating the land as a commodity that can be traded or exchanged. Such a transaction could be seen as a denial of the Palestinian people's right to determine their future on their own terms, as well as their claim to sovereignty and self-governance. Furthermore, international law recognizes the principle of territorial integrity, which asserts that national borders should not be altered without the consent of the people who inhabit them. Any move to buy Gaza and relocate its people would raise legal questions about the legitimacy of such an action, both from a Palestinian and international law perspective. While the practical goal may be to end the humanitarian suffering, the legal and ethical consequences of such a proposal are far-reaching. Would this proposal violate the core principles of international law? And if so, would its benefits justify the costs? Examining the psychological impact of conflict and displacement. While the geopolitical and economic dimensions of the Gaza conflict are often at the forefront of discourse, the psychological toll on the people directly involved cannot be overstated. Conflict and displacement leave deep scars, not only on the physical landscape, but also on the mental and emotional well-being of individuals. In the case of Gaza, this psychological impact has been both profound and enduring, affecting generations of Palestinians who have lived through cycles of violence, displacement, and uncertainty. Understanding this emotional and psychological dimension is essential to truly grasping the complexities of the conflict and the challenges of finding a lasting resolution. The trauma of war, whether from airstrikes, ground invasions, or the constant fear of violence, has a profound impact on mental health. Children, who are often the most vulnerable in such environments, face developmental challenges and emotional scars that can last a lifetime. The loss of family members, the destruction of homes, and the disruption of daily life contribute to a pervasive sense of grief, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But it is not just the immediate effects of trauma that are concerning. There is a generational aspect to this suffering. Children who grow up in an environment of conflict are at a higher risk of experiencing long-term psychological issues, perpetuating a cycle of trauma that can affect entire communities. Displacement, a frequent consequence of conflict, adds another layer to this psychological burden. The Palestinian experience of displacement is not merely physical but emotional. For those forced to flee their homes or live in refugee camps, there is a profound sense of loss, not just of a home, but of identity. Gaza's residents have lived under a blockade for over a decade, with limited access to basic needs such as healthcare, education, and employment opportunities. For many, the act of displacement is not temporary. It is an enduring state of limbo, a sense of belonging nowhere. This prolonged uncertainty creates anxiety and despair, further compounding the mental health crisis. The psychological toll of living under constant threat of violence and displacement can lead to feelings of hopelessness, alienation, and despair. For many Palestinians, the future feels like an unreachable horizon, clouded by the persistent realities of occupation, poverty, and conflict. This sense of powerlessness contributes to a cycle of radicalization, where extreme political or ideological movements may offer a sense of agency or hope to those who feel they have none. Moreover, the effects of trauma are not limited to those directly affected by conflict. The broader society, including neighboring regions and global communities, also experiences psychological impacts. International indifference or the perception of external actors acting with ulterior motives can fuel frustration, resentment, and a sense of injustice. The emotional burden of watching a community suffer without meaningful intervention can lead to collective feelings of guilt or helplessness, complicating efforts for international solidarity. Addressing the psychological impact of conflict requires more than just providing material aid. It necessitates a comprehensive mental health response. In regions like Gaza, where mental health services are often inadequate or inaccessible, the need for psychological support becomes even more pressing. This involves not only addressing immediate trauma through counseling and therapy, but also creating long-term support systems that focus on community resilience, rebuilding trust, and providing opportunities for healing. Additionally, international organizations and governments must prioritize mental health as a central component of peace-building efforts. Psychological healing must go hand in hand with political solutions, as the two are deeply interconnected. If individuals and communities cannot heal emotionally, it becomes difficult to build a stable and sustainable peace. Long-term peace-building strategies should therefore incorporate trauma-informed care and community-based approaches to mental health, focusing on resilience, recovery, and reconciliation. The psychological effects of conflict and displacement are not easily quantified, but they are undeniably real. Without addressing these emotional and psychological dimensions, any attempt to resolve the Gaza conflict risks being incomplete, as the trauma of generations cannot be overlooked. True peace will require not just a cessation of violence, but a healing of hearts and minds, a process that is slow, complex, and requires deep empathy, understanding, and long-term commitment from all parties involved.